for one moment while I get it recording. There we go. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to pass things over to Peter Salson.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, and thank you all for being here with me. And I need to find the presentation or else we won't go anywhere. Okay. Give me a thumbs up if you see a PowerPoint title slide. Very good. Okay, so thank you all for being here, and thanks to Rabbi Zarin and all of Temple Emanu-El for giving me the opportunity. It's really been a great honor for me to share my thoughts with you these past several Tuesday nights and tonight. And I'm glad there's been some interest to the extent that I can pick a favorite lecture of these three. Tonight's is the one. So I hope especially that this one works for you all. As I've been explaining in the previous two lectures, this is the result of a lifelong struggle between two sides of my life that I was having a great deal of difficulty integrating. Reading Heschel was the breakthrough for me personally. And what I want to do tonight in particular is share what I learned from reading the books of Abraham Joshua Heschel about, call it a scientific worldview fully hospitable to Jewish commitment, or an understanding of Jewish belief fully consistent with a commitment to science. I'm not sure which is a better description of the project that I'll be explaining to you tonight. Before I get into the new material, I want to do a quick reminder of the takeaway lessons from the first two lectures. So from lecture 1, 2 Tuesdays ago, we were talking about wonder and how it has served as a gateway emotion into scientific discovery, religious thought, philosophy, you name it. And we talked about various aspects of existence that evoked wonder. And I made the claim, which I may have convinced you of or maybe not, that things that are higher in a scale of powers of being tend to be the things that are most evocative of wonder. When we met last time, I was talking about time and comparing and contrasting two rather different views of how time works. There's the way time fits into physics, the way physics describes time, and that goes under the name of frozen time, sometimes because it doesn't have a sense of flow, and it's as if, from the point of view of physics, past, present, and future are all in existence all at once, so to speak. It's hard to speak precisely about things like this with our language. I contrasted that with flowing time, which is the way time feels to most of us as we live most of our lives. And I illustrated that with poetry and song lyrics and the words of the early 20th century French philosopher Henri Bergson. Along the way, I argued that frozen time fits best with things that along the ascending scale of powers of existence that I like to organize things along. Frozen time goes at the lower end, flowing time at the higher end. And one thing that helped me connect with Heschel was my seeing very early in my reading of his works how important time is to him, and how in fact he describes Judaism as a way of redeeming temporal existence of a human being in flowing time by linking it to the eternal. Now what I'd like to do is describe what I'm going to cover tonight. And last time I contrasted the dramatic arc of week two's lecture with week one. Now I want to contrast the way this lecture is going to work a bit with the first 2 weeks. The first week on wonder was here's something amazing, here's something else amazing. Everything built together and seemed harmonious. Last week on time, it was a contrast between two almost irreconcilable views of time. Tonight, I'm going to be presenting an argument. And the argument has 3 parts. I'll walk you through them on this slide in just a moment. But what I want to say is part 3, which is the punchline of the whole lecture series, depends strongly enough on parts 1 and 2 that I actually want to do something slightly different with our time tonight. Instead of asking you all to hold questions until the end, I'm going to pause for question breaks at the end of part 1, and then again at the end of part 2, to ask for any clarifying questions in particular that you all may have. And then of course, I hope there will be plenty of time for questions at the end of the whole lecture. So part 1 is about the many meanings of the concept of the physical universe. And in summary right now, I'll say a lot more about it as we go on through the lecture tonight. The physical universe is the whole of which every physical thing is a part. It's also a physical thing in its own right. Part 2, I'm going to step away from describing results of physics per se and make a claim that isn't something that my physics colleagues always will make or even would be comfortable making. And that is, I'm going to make the claim that to understand existence, we have to think of the world as having 2 rather different sides. One is the physical universe that I, in my disciplinary activities, am comfortable with, the physical universe. I'll call it also, in part 2, the world of things. And I want to contrast that with the world of persons. And I'll explain why I think it's important for us to be able to see the one world in which we live as having these 2 different sides. At the end of each of those 2 sections, I'll ask for clarifying questions, as I said, and then the punchline of the lecture series is going to come in section 3, where I make an argument that just as the world has 2 different sides, we need 2 different kinds of wholes to represent all the things that make up existence. And I'll introduce, in addition to the physical universe, the whole associated with the world of things, a different kind of personal whole that's appropriate to the world of persons. And this will be what I argue Heschel was teaching us to recognize as God. So that's the outline. Here is one of my wonder pictures. When I'm in an astronomical mood, this is the picture that evokes the most wonder for me. Of course, you remember from week 1, I argued that nature, microbiology, or human beings and human culture are equally or even more so ways of evoking wonder, but there's nothing wrong with this picture at all. It's really beautiful. Now I want to also remind you of something from last week. I'm going to, in a moment, be drawing some new space-time diagrams for you all. Let me give you a reminder of how we construct and how we interpret a space-time diagram. So here's a slide that you all saw last week. Here are sketches of where the Earth is in its orbit around the sun for different months throughout the year. Think of them as freeze frames from a movie, if you will. And if you want to, instead of looking at individual pictures or frames in a movie, start to build up a space-time diagram interpretation of the phenomenon of the Earth going around the sun, you can stack those various pictures in the vertical direction, where the vertical direction is going to represent time in the space-time diagram and place them at heights corresponding to to the time at which that sketch represents the state of the universe, at least 2 dimensions of it. And then all you have to do is recall that you now have a diagram in 3 dimensions, 2 space directions. The vertical one is time. In between those snapshots, of course, the Earth was at different places on January 1, January 2, January 10th, February 1st, and so on. So it's actually not a discrete set of slices, but the Earth is somewhere in its orbit around the sun at any moment. And if you want to think about the Earth's position at all those times, there's a smooth curve called the Earth's world line through a space-time diagram. It has the shape of a helix, and you see it sketched right here. And so now we have a space-time diagram that shows the Earth throughout an entire year, all in a single snapshot. So rather than time passing the way we normally experience it, we've captured it in a static looking presentation, even though of course that vertical direction is representing time. Okay, so that's a reminder. Now, here's one other reminder of an ultra simple space-time diagram. This is the space-time diagram of a ball thrown by me, and I'm going to stop the share momentarily and do again this amazing demo. You all see the ball? If you didn't, let me do it one more time. Okay, amazing, right? Let's look again at how that's represented. Oops, let's get back to where I was. There we go. So the ball leaving my hand flies upward at an ever slower rate. It stops and starts falling down at a faster rate. And if we represent just that one dimension of space, the vertical dimension, along this axis, and time in the vertical axis, as is traditional for space-time diagrams, we can represent that ball's entire motion through that entire second that you watched by the single static curve. That's the ball's world line. Okay, so that we saw last time. Now I want to extend it. And here I have to make a confession. No matter how hard I throw that ball upward, it's always going to fall down. And even, it's not just because I'm a wimp, even if I were, I'll date myself, Sandy Koufax, or I'll date myself almost as badly, Roger Clemens, no matter which human being throws a ball upward, it's going to fall down. But the world is actually richer than that. If you have a much more powerful arm, call it a rocket, and you put that ball on the top of a sufficiently energetic rocket, you can give that ball enough energy by making it travel upwards fast enough that it will never fall down. So we aren't restricted to world lines for a ball thrown upward that look like this. With a powerful enough rocket, we can have world lines of a ball that never comes back down to ground level from which it left. It's either really exciting to you. I loved the space age as a kid and even today. Maybe that excites you all too. In any case, it's an important matter of principle, irrespective of whether you are really excited about rockets and space exploration or not. So these different shapes of world lines represent different possible histories for a ball launched upward. Now, Believe it or not, that was an important warm-up to my asking the question, what is the universe? When we use that term universe, what are we referring to? And I want to suggest that it has at least three important, somewhat distinct meanings. One meaning of the term universe is the set of every physical thing that exists. That's probably the first definition any of us would come up with for the term. But I want to also suggest that it can be helpful instead to think of the universe not as a set where it contains every individual physical thing, but to think of it as a whole of which all those physical things are a part. And there's a subtle distinction between those two definitions that I will be explaining as we go on. The third meaning of the term universe is perhaps the most surprising one to most people when they first learn it. And that is, not only is the universe the set of every individual physical thing that exists, and also the whole of which every physical thing is a part, the universe is itself, in some important senses, a physical thing, governed by laws of nature appropriate to it, just as the individual physical things that are constituents of the universe are governed by laws of nature. And that's an important and strange enough idea that it's up to me now to explain this. So first, I want to refer to another diagram that you may remember from last time, this space-time diagram showing the world lines of 5 individual people. You can see that the world lines begin and end at birth and death. Oh, I meant to cover up that word. That word has no meaning there. Just think about birth and death here. And so now let's ask, what do we mean when we want to say that the universe is everything that exists and maybe everybody that exists everywhere? We might also mean, and usually do, that it's not just everything that exists throughout all time. And then this cube out of a full space-time diagram might be a nice way to remind ourselves of that kind of definition of the universe. The universe is the set of all of these things at all times, so it's a set of all histories of all things that exist. But now I want to say that looking at that all in total, looking at it in the form of a space-time diagram, we might not want to focus on the individual parts, but focus on the whole that consists of all of those individual parts. So we can focus on the whole space-time diagram. Of course, this is just a section of a space-time diagram. There's more to the left and right, front and back, and of course, up and down represents the past and the future of the universe. So looking at this picture, it's got a little more meaning to it because after all, when we look up at night, we don't just see our terrestrial environment, but we're looking far into space. And because the speed of light is only a finite speed, we're actually looking back in time. So we're actually, every time we go out and it's clear, we're exploring, in some sense, a huge portion of the universe. Now, people have been seeing beautiful pictures of the universe like this for as long as there have been people, but our modern understanding actually is due to these two special people in the photograph here. I think most people would recognize Albert Einstein. This is from 1931, so maybe people have seen pictures more often of him slightly older. Here is a famous name, but his picture's not so famous. This is Edwin Hubble. And it was Edwin Hubble who discovered that the universe is expanding, and Einstein who taught us how to understand it. And I really treasure this picture. Einstein made a special pilgrimage to the telescope that Hubble used to discover the expansion of the universe, and made at least this ceremonial view through a viewfinder. He was not really seeing the expansion of the universe just then, but just checking out the equipment that Edwin Hubble used. Now, the story of the expanding universe is pretty important for understanding what I want to say about the nature of the universe and then the extension of that even beyond the physics story. So Einstein was actually, you may not have noticed in this picture on the previous slide, look again at the expression on his face. Does he look smug and happy, or does he look overwhelmingly joyful? I don't think so. He actually was really chagrined, because in 1915, when Einstein proposed the general theory of relativity, our modern theory of gravitation and of space and time, Einstein came this close to having been able to predict the expansion of the universe. In fact, at one moment, the equations on the paper in front of him predicted precisely that. And he looked at them and he said, nah, can't be. And he stuck in a fudge factor to make that phenomenon go away. So when Hubble in 1929 discovered that the universe was expanding, Einstein went, oh my goodness, I really messed up, really blew a chance to make the scientific prediction of all time. So that's why he didn't look so happy in 1931 when he was visiting Hubble in the Mount Wilson Observatory. But Einstein and the rest of us got over it, and it was Einstein's understanding of gravity and space and time without the fudge factor that he put in that was then used by Hubble and others to understand what it meant for the all of the galaxies in the universe to be flying apart from one another, this phenomenon called the expansion of the universe. And the more people thought about the implications, the more strange it became, not least of which was because Einstein's theory forces us to think not about the individual parts of the universe, but about space-time as a whole. So here I've got another schematic space-time diagram on the right, and let's learn to understand what it means. So time is running vertically like any space-time diagram, and the rest of the dimensions of the diagram are representing spatial dimensions. Here we're representing them a little differently. Here in this schematic space-time diagram, the entire set of galaxies throughout all space are represented as objects drawn on the surface of a balloon. And the two dimensions of the surface of that balloon are standing in for the three true dimensions of space. Now, if you look, earlier in this space-time diagram, the balloon is small. Later in the space-time diagram, the balloon gets bigger. The galaxies themselves don't get bigger, but they are farther apart from each other the later in the history of the universe that we consider it. And that in a schematic form is the meaning of the expansion of the universe. So the universe is bigger at later times, smaller at earlier times. If you extrapolate this pattern backwards, there is a time in the finite past when the universe had zero size. That is the beginning of the universe, the beginning of time, the beginning of everything. And it's such a big deal that we call it the Big Bang. Now, that's strange enough. But now let me tell you something that I found astounding when I learned it as a university student of physics. using Einstein's theory of space and time, called general relativity, it's possible to derive a really simple equation that tells you, okay, if the universe has a certain size at a certain time and it's expanding at a certain rate, what is going to happen to the universe subsequently? The equation is simple. It's almost as simple as the equation that tells me what happens to a ball when I throw it either with my hand or with a rocket. And if I ask how far apart are any two galaxies that I want to pay attention to, the patterns of future history of the universe look almost precisely like the possibilities for throwing a ball up in the air with my hand or a rocket. The universe, just like the ball, when I throw it myself, always comes down. There's a possibility for the universe to expand for a while and then contract and end in a big crash. And the curve looks just like this. It's worldwide. There are other possibilities where the universe expands forever. Now, this is not a course in modern physical cosmology, so I won't be describing to you under which conditions which thing is going to happen to the universe. It's amazing. It's really cool. We're still just figuring it out, but that's not my point tonight. My point tonight is that one of the most important aspects of the universe, its expansion, is so simple that I can tell the whole story by solving a simple equation and graphing the solution on a simple space-time diagram that looks just like the space-time diagram of a ball thrown up in the air. And I think that's a profound fact. It's profound enough that I want to draw the lesson that that says is just like a ball is a physical thing. From some points of view, the universe as a whole is a physical thing. It's got behavior governed by simple equations that we can solve, and we can summarize them in really the same terms as we describe the motion of what we would all agree is an ordinary physical thing, like a ball that we can hold in my hand. So that's, I think, an astounding recognition that we got from Einstein's understanding of space and time and the help he got from Edwin Hubble's astronomical observations. So let's think what this means. This means in part that space and time are governed by physics. I learned this equation. I learned how to solve it. I learned how to make graphs of its solutions. But remember that space and time are actually the things that allow us to talk about the relationships among physical things. Space is how we reckon are things near or far. Time is how we reckon are events earlier or later than others. So the universe has become this really subtle thing. It's the set of everything, it's a thing, it's the set of relationships among all physical things. Now, let me point out a few other cool, interesting facts about the universe. One is that these diagrams have some slightly tricky interpretations to them. First of all, this balloon represents all of space. This balloon represents all of space at an earlier time. This represents it at an earlier time still. We needed a pretend background space to draw the picture. But actually, there is no background space into which the universe is expanding. It's space itself that's expanding. Another thing, we could have an earlier diagram with a smaller balloon. We can have an earliest diagram with a balloon of 0 size. The space-time diagram starts there. There is no time before the Big Bang. The Big Bang was the birth of time as well as of space. So here's summaries of those two ideas, representing how the universe is itself a physical thing. Each balloon surface represents all of space at a given instant of time, and space-time is represented by all balloons shown and not shown in that diagram. And there is an earliest balloon representing when space-time, including time itself, came into being, the time we call the Big Bang. Nevertheless, remember that space is how we reckon near and far, time how we reckon before and after. So they are relationship. Space-time is about relationship, but it's also a thing. So what we've learned is the set of relationships among individual things is itself a physical thing. So the universe is kind of a strange place. Here's my summary up to the moment. The physical universe is the set of all individual physical things. It's all of space and time, which is the basis of relationships. And because we can understand on the basis of simple physical laws how that whole set behaves, it is a physical thing itself. And that's what we mean when we say the universe is a whole of which every individual thing is a part. Now, that was a lot. I want to pause here for a moment. I want to look at the gallery, and if you want to ask me to go back over one or more of those points, please type something into the chat or make some frantic motion with your hand, and one way or the other, I'll try to call on you. Okay, someone who just has the name iPhone, who just raised your hand. What can you say your question? First unmute, yes.
Yeah, the Big Bang would correlate in the idea that there wasn't any time before the Big Bang, because in biblical Hebrew, the Bereshit, the vase, signifies the beginning of time.
Yes.
And how do you view the Torah existed before time?
How do I view that the Torah existed before time?
Yes.
As something poetic that I'm not sure I want to try to put a scientific interpretation on, unless you want to start getting metaphorical about the concept of before. But I don't want to try to say I've got a simple explanation for that that interpretation of our sacred texts. It's a really important religious question, and maybe we can talk about it again once I've gotten back to religion, but I'm still speaking as a physicist this portion of the lecture. So questions about that introduction to the physics? Or have I convinced you that the universe is in fact a whole, that we can understand it? Okay, I see a question from Mark and Katya. It's Katya, how can time come into being? How can space arise from nothing? Good questions. And they're so good that I have to just say, I'm afraid, Katya, that in a way, the way you phrase the questions, which are 100% common sense, sensible questions, actually step outside how physics is trying to teach us to understand. So if I may, it seems that implicit in the way you would phrase the question, how can time come into being, that it's as if we had a time before time, or how can space arise from nothing? When we pose that question, and I've asked the same question myself, it's even the way we would frame it in ordinary language, we've got a picture that's hard to get away from of time before the birth of time, time before the birth of space. All I can say is our best understanding of the physical nature of existence is that we have to shed those ways of thinking and see the birth of even these fundamental concepts like when and where, that they came into existence. So it's too good a question for me to give you an answer. Okay, I see Naomi is raising a hand. Will you unmute yourself, please?
Well, I can't even wrap my mind around it, but if the universe obeys certain physical rules, how can you be sure that the same rules are obeyed the same way every point in the universe? Or, you know, now and later.
Yes, that is another outstanding question. One can't take it for granted that the laws of nature are unchanged. The best we can do is take it as a hypothesis, as a guess that they're unchanged, see how the behavior of the universe would be if that were true, compare that prediction to observations that we can make, and see if those observations are consistent with that guess. And the good news for the simplicity of science is that it really does appear that if you make the supposition that the laws are unchanged, that you see a picture of the world as we observe it that's consistent with that. But every time people think of a new way to observe the universe, you then have to say, okay, let me apply that method of observation and check the constancy of the physical laws again. Because as much as we hope it would be true, because otherwise science would be almost impossible, nevertheless, you have to check it because it's a really important possibility. Anyone says the laws of nature that I understand predicts that time and space came into being, had better be prepared to defend that kind of prediction against excellent questions just like that. Do we have any other clarifying questions? Okay, I see the first questioner raising his hand again. Do you want to unmute again and ask?
What about the black holes? Remembering your discussion of black holes, how do the black holes fit into that finite the finite space and time? Don't the black holes?
Let me just say, black holes, from this vast cosmic point of view, are just things, like other things, like stars and planets and rocks and people. As much as I love black holes, they don't seem to be the most important part of this story. So maybe time for one other clarifying question before we go on. Michael Goldenberg, I see your hand raised. Please unmute yourself. Okay.
Excuse me, Peter. We have all these equations by which we can predict and confirm what's going on in the universe. Mm-hmm. But do the equations tell us why this is happening, or just what is happening?
Much more the what than the why. The closest that physics comes to answering the why is to say, I believe that this is the law of nature, and if it's the law of nature, then this kind of thing will happen. That kind of why physics can do. Why is, of course, a really big word. Why sometimes means not is the cause, what's the cause of, but what is the goal of. Physics doesn't do that. We'll come back to thinking in causal terms. What is the cause of that versus what's the goal of that in the next part of the lecture. If y'all don't mind, I think I would like to say thank you for those clarifying questions, and let me move on to the next section. If there are more questions even on this first part, of course, at the end of our time together, you can ask, of course. So now, let's see, is this going to let me go? Yes. All right, on to part two. In part two, I'm going to claim that we can only understand existence, and I'm using that word instead of the universe for a reason you'll see in a moment. We can only understand existence if we recognize that it has two sides. The physical universe that we've been talking about and everything that's in it represents one of those sides, every physical thing that is. But then there's human beings, scientists, people who ask questions of a scientist at a science lecture, and everyone else. And the claim I want to make is that persons operate in such a different way that we really need a separate description of existence to include persons. So let me say, to summarize all the physics I've been talking about before, we have this physical universe made up of physical things. Sometimes we just call it the world, sometimes the universe. I'll try to be a little more precise from now on. This is the aspect of things that the sciences describe, that laws of nature predict. These are causal laws, which is a fancy word for saying, if I know things at a certain time, then I can predict the future based on how things were in the past. That's how science works. And in that set of questions, that way of describing existence, time as frozen space-time is a perfectly good, in fact, even better way of describing how things work than any other view of time. So that's the world of things, the physical universe. But now I want to read you a really beautiful sentence by one of my favorite thinkers, Marilynne Robinson, novelist of Homecoming, Gilead, and several other really great novels, but also a really fabulous and thoughtful essayist. And here, from one of her essays, she wrote the best one-sentence summary of the need for a world of persons in our view. She wrote, "It may have been perverse of destiny to array perception across billions of subjectivities, read persons, but that fact is central to human life and language and culture, and no philosophy, no cognitive science, or she could have said any other science, should be allowed to evade the fact of the world being full of persons, people with consciousness, goals, ideas, etc." And what she's referring to is the texture of human life. We have not only consciousness, we make choices, we have desires, we perform actions, we aim at goals, we are sometimes disappointed, we're sometimes satisfied, sometimes we persevere, sometimes we fail to, we have aspirations. All of these things are essential if we are going to describe how existence feels to us. But they have no place in the physical description of the world that I learned as a student of physics and that I taught as a professor of physics. We persons, after all, we value accomplishment, truth, goodness, and our lives don't work by us being robots. We can't take a complete description of me or you or anyone else at one instant and predict what we're going to do in the future. And that's what it means to be a person. And we are persons in relationship to other persons. And as a result, frozen space-time doesn't work for us. We as persons have the experience of time that flows, of a now that is meaningful, that we share, and a now that passes on from one moment to another, as described by Henri Bergson. So let's examine the concept of law. As a physicist, I was proud to learn and then proud to teach the laws of nature. And those laws govern what happened in the physical universe. And in fact, the physical universe seems to be the basis for the laws that govern what goes on in it. The laws of nature. Here's a pre-response to Naomi's question. As near as we can tell, and we checked every chime we get, the laws of nature are the same throughout the universe and throughout history. And when we know the correct physical law, it governs precisely how physical things behave with no exceptions. The past determines the present and the future. And that's why frozen space-time works. On the other hand, law as it applies to persons works really differently. We respond to moral laws. We choose to obey them or we choose not to. Some of each. We have freedom. So we are neither governed precisely by physical laws, nor are we governed precisely, for better or for worse, by moral laws. And that's why the world of persons isn't causal at all. The present and the future aren't determined by the past, but our lives are aimed at creating the best possible future state as we see it. And the polysyllabic word for that is teleological, aimed at the future. And the only way this kind of existence makes sense is with time experienced as a flow, like Bergson described. It's a dimension in which we live out our actions. So now you may wonder, I have a physical body. Aren't I part of the world of things? And the answer is yes. To the extent that I am associated with my physical body, I am a part of the world of things. But the most human aspects of our existence are part of the world of persons. So we straddle both of the two sides of existence. And I want to simultaneously insist that we need to look at existence with both sides visible, but also insist just the same that they are both describing a single united world. Kind of strange. So here's my summary of the difference between these two sides. The world of things has frozen time, laws of nature with no exceptions, and the past determining the present and the future, whereas the world of persons involves flowing time, moral laws that people choose to obey or not, and at each moment, persons being free to choose their actions aimed at future goals. Now, here's another place for me to pause and ask for some clarifying questions, because this is not a usual way of describing the nature of existence. I never heard this in any physics lecture I was ever given, but I did learn it from reading Heschel. So I see Naomi's got a hand up, so unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Okay, well, this is going to end up leading to the idea of a soul, I think, something that is supernatural. But if you believe that we are just what our DNA has dictated, and even our moral values and all can be traced to chemical balances and experience and reaction. I mean, even an amoeba will avoid something that's in its way and go around it. And so we're just interacting, but it's all based on our physical laws of genetics, which is also sort of the past is determining the present.
Okay. May I respond? That is a point of view which I used to share, which many people share with you. And my claim is that it can't really be true. It can't be 100% true. Of course, everything we've learned about how cells work, for take just one example, is a description that mainly works in the world of things according to causal laws. But at the end of the day, I don't think that either I or you or anyone else I'm seeing in the Zoom gallery has as an alibi for what we failed to do as well as we hoped to do, that, oh, my atoms made me do it. Okay, so somehow we have to picture how it can be true that we are fully and fundamentally rooted in our physical nature, but that our physical nature allows us to make choices aimed at future goals, not determined by the past. Now, that may be a statement of faith on my part, but if you'll forgive me, I believe that on the basis of settled scientific knowledge, your claim is also a basis of faith. We surely do not have the capacity to show how my choice to give this lecture this way and not a much more confusing way was based on my atoms. Okay? So these are 2 points of view, and I'm not going to just win by asserting that mine is correct and that yours is not, but what I'm going to ask you to do is humor me for the rest of our time together and listen to where this goes. Let me just respond to your prediction that this is going to lead to a soul. Not necessarily. Okay, I don't intend to use that word again unless someone forces me to. You won't see it on any of my slides. Okay, one more question. This one from Sheldon. Go ahead, please unmute. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm okay with the two worlds of persons and things, except I'm still, and we discussed this last week a little bit, and that is I don't see the difference between frozen time and flowing time, because I believe that flowing time is just an infinite number of frozen time slots, and so I think they are the same, and not two distinct different.
Yes, and I recall that comment from last time, and maybe we'll have some time at the very end to get back to that.
Or maybe in person one day.
Or maybe in person, right. One more clarifying question before.
If we have time for it, there was a question in the chat that I actually also shared, which was from Ann Miller.
Oh yes, which side
do animals fall on?
Yes, which side do other animals fall on? A great question. The answer is, I think, and now I'll quote my favorite philosopher, Hans Jonas, who said that every living thing, no matter how primitive, if I'm allowed to use that word, has, in his language, a horizon of transcendence. That is to say, just as human beings straddle the two sides, so to some degree, perhaps a lesser degree in very simple animals, Naomi mentioned, to some degree, to the extent that an amoeba is trying to that food, get away from that nasty dried out spot, that amoeba is to some extent exercising a kind of freedom or teleological action. So great question. So there will be time for more questions when I get done, but let's get to the point where I'm done. So let me get to slides. And now, if it will let me. This is a problem. Oh, here we go. Now, I would like to present, based on these two ideas I introduced, which, as you saw, were based on things from the previous 2 weeks, an argument in the form of an argument by analogy of why you should believe in God. And this is an argument that I discovered by carefully reading and rereading God in Search of Man by Abraham Joshua Heschel. And he actually is making 2 points. One is God is real, and you ought to be able to recognize that if only you read your Heschel. And furthermore, Heschel says moral law has priority in the structure of the universe. And although he didn't use the term the two sides, all of his reasoning along these lines is based on seeing the world in the form in terms of these two sides. I've shown you this picture of Heschel before. Let's move on to his argument. Heschel's argument starts this way. How can you understand an individual tree? He asks. And as a rhetorical question, he gives the answer, you can't. You can only understand what a tree is in relationship to other trees, the tree that made the seed from which it grew, for example, only in relationship to the whole forest, the earth in which it's got its, the carbon dioxide that it breathes and that takes up the oxygen that it breathes out, the sunlight that shines down. In other words, a tree only makes sense if you understand it in its whole entire context. And to the extent that we want to consider a tree a physical object, which it is to a very large degree, then we only understand a tree by situating it in the physical universe. And as I was describing before, the physical universe is itself a physical thing, just as its contents. And this is a reminder, Heschel is reminding us, that parts and wholes share essential attributes. The whole associated with physical things is also a physical thing. And I'm going to put the whole argument in one table that would fit on the front of a t-shirt. And I filled in the first row of this table. This is a row labeled things. I could have labeled it the world of things, perhaps. And there are two columns to that row. A column describing what are the parts of the world of things and what's the whole of the world of things. And the parts of the world of things are physical things, material objects. And the whole associated with the world of things is the physical universe. So far, not too astonishing. So I think I've already said that, so let's go on. I'm going to let Marilyn Robinson be our reminder, as if we needed it, that our world contains persons, billions of them. And I'll let her be the reminder of the claim that I'm willing to make more strongly than perhaps Naomi, that deterministic laws can't possibly be true to our experience as persons. And so we need to ask, how do persons fit into the world? Don't they need a different kind of whole to correspond to the fact that persons are very different kinds of things as individual parts? So let's work according to the structure of an analogy. How can you understand a single person? You can't. You can only understand who a person is in relationship to other persons, to society, to history, to who that person's parents were, who that person's children are, who are the person's neighbors, who are the person's teachers, and so on. So you only understand a person by situating her or him in the world of persons. And now this raises a question. What can we say about the world of persons? And here is the analogy on one slide. Just as the set of relationships between all physical things is itself a physical thing, just as the whole associated with physical things is itself a physical thing, so too the set of relationships between all personal beings, the whole associated with all persons, must have a personal character. Wholes share essential features with their parts. So the physical universe is a physical thing, but there must be a personal whole. It's my term. You won't see that term in Heschel. I'll translate it into Heschel language in a little bit. But there must be a personal whole within whom individual persons relate to one another, just as there needs to be a physical universe within which we can understand how physical things relate to other. And so now let's express that in tabular form. And now I'm going to call this the theological analogy. 2 rows, things and persons, or world of things if you prefer, world of persons. 2 columns, part and whole. So we already saw that the lower row, the world of things, its parts are material objects, its whole is the physical universe. The world of persons, its parts are all conscious beings. Throw in your favorite animals there to the extent that you want. And there needs to be a different kind of whole that I'm provisionally going to call a personal whole. So the lower row of the table says that there's a physical whole associated with material objects. It's the physical universe. The physical universe is the set of all material objects as well as all of their relations. And the whole associated with all physical things, the physical universe, is itself a physical thing. Now, here in the same format is the story told by the higher row of the table. There is a whole associated with the personal aspects of the universe. That personal whole is the set of all persons as well as all of the relationships between them. And the personal whole needs to have a personal character, just as the physical whole, that is the physical universe, has a physical character. See where this is going? Recall that law works really different in the 2 sides. The laws of nature govern the behavior of physical things in the physical universe, whereas in the world of persons, law plays a different role. We have freedom, so our behavior is not determined by laws. We hear laws as commandments, and we hear them almost as if, or perhaps as if, it is a voice of the personal whole and joining us to obey those laws. And there's no guarantee that we will obey that voice. It's up to us. And because it's up to us and because everything is in suspense as we move from now to the future, we need to have time as a flow of becoming in which we live out our actions. So I want to add an extra row to this summary slide. The physical universe is the set of all physical things, all of space and time and their relationships, the ground of the laws of nature, and the physical universe is a physical thing. And by comparison, the personal whole is the set of all conscious beings, all of time experienced as the flow of being, shared in relationship, the giver of moral law, and in some sense, a personal being. And now, do you see the parallels that Heschel is inviting us to see? Things, individual things are the parts of this world of things, conscious beings in the side of persons. Time is the flow of being on the personal side. Space and time as a frozen system is the structure of the physical universe. The physical universe grounds the laws of nature. The personal whole tells us the moral law. And just as the physical universe is a physical thing, the personal whole is a personal being. And now I want to translate into language that Heschel would recognize. The personal whole that I've been talking about is what we mean by God. The personal whole is the source of the moral law that guides our behavior. Our laws, call them commandments or mitzvot, and they are the property of the personal whole, just as the laws of nature are properties of the physical universe. And we all know, especially this time of year, that we're going to fail to fully live up to those laws, and yet we still hear a voice calling us to live up to them. and telling us, try again. And so, if Heschel had been drawing this diagram, he wouldn't have put a horrible term like personal whole in the upper right. He would have put in the word God. And this is a theological analogy that I learned to relate my understanding of science to my understanding of the teachings of Judaism from reading Heschel. And I want to summarize what Heschel taught us with one other phrase that it's even shorter than a haiku, just 9 words. He said, the world consists not of things, but of tasks. In other words, Heschel is saying, yeah, things are important, but they're not what's most important. What really builds the world, what the world is really made of, is persons and our attempt to live up to the tasks that God has set us. So here I'll leave you with this summary slide of the reason I learned from Heschel that I ought to believe in God, and that I'm offering it to you for you to ponder. And this is now time for me to take more questions. So please, if you would, since we've reached the end, let's go back to our pattern of writing questions in the chat. So I am all eyes and ears for your questions. Okay, I see Mark has raised his hand through the chat. So Mark, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, couldn't another definition of personal whole be community? The expectations of community for you to be moral. There are plenty of moral atheists who don't believe in God yet act moral, and it's part of their personal whole.
Yes, that's an excellent suggestion. And I have found books in which people say precisely that whole associated with persons is a set of all persons, or in your word, community, which isn't even quite so vast. And it's perhaps my training as a physicist that has me looking for the largest and most inclusive whole, and community is maybe too small to be that inclusive. Let me give you one other reason why I prefer the biggest picture as opposed to the big picture writ small as in community. If it was just a matter, important as it is, of how we learn our morals, how we learn how we ought to behave, and where we see ourselves being judged, then community, for many reasons, would fit just fine. But since I, as a physicist, have come to believe that the way physics describes the world as a frozen space-time where past, present, and future are all equally present, with scare quotes, community, as it's normally described to me, is something that drops into the world very nicely. It's something that fits in the east side of Providence, say, to say something slightly more flippantly than you mean it. Okay, whereas I think existence needs room for the possibility of being a person, for the possibility of having free will and not being a mechanically determined machine. And so I need to blow up, on behalf of Heschel, need to blow up the tyranny of saying, oh, the universe is the way physicists describe it, but we're people and we live in communities and communities teach us things. I think the story has to be bigger than that, as important as your point actually is.
Maybe I used the wrong word by community. A person's relationship with other living beings.
Sure. Okay. And that's very good. That's better. It doesn't just fit on the east side. So I take that back. But even so, it's still unless one says something as radical as I think Heschel is trying to teach us, saying the world doesn't even consist of things, it consists of tasks. We need to locate our human existence in the vastest possible kind of context. And so I think we need what I'm calling a personal whole and what Heschel was calling God, and I agree with him. Okay, and I have a question in the chat from Sheldon, maybe Evie, but probably Sheldon, and then I'll call on Saul next. Sheldon writes, if it's you, Sheldon, conflict between faith-based science and faith-based religion or God. Do you want to expand that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's a fundamental conflict. Science is a fact-based, science is fact-based, and religion is faith-based. And again, we won't debate now the frozen time versus flow time. We can do that afterwards. But to me, the personal world is not, the world is not just tasks. A tree, as you just described before, is a tree. A tree is not a task. It's a tree. It's a physical object. Yes, you can talk about it in relationship to other trees and its seeds and the leaves, et cetera, but those are not tasks. Those are physical things. And religion, if you can use this term, believe it or not, is faith-based. It's a belief. And you can't tie the physical to the belief, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you for that. That's a really good point, but allow me to beg to differ. Okay, of course, science tries as hard as it possibly can to be built on facts, but science, I believe, is incomplete. Science doesn't count for us. I disagree with the point of view that Naomi defended. I'm not saying that that's her final answer, but the point of view that Naomi very ably defended of, okay, I as a human being am built of all these parts, and we know the rules that govern the parts. Those are the facts, and therefore, since we know what our parts are and we know what the rules are, therefore, what I'm going to do into the indefinite future is determined. That is not fact-based. That is faith-based.
No, it's only faith-based because we haven't figured it out yet.
And in time,
I believe we will know more about the human body and the human mind, and it will become fact-based.
And your statement is the best illustration of what I mean by the claims of science being faith-based. You have faith, sincere faith, that what we don't understand now, we will understand in the future. I know a beautiful American spiritual that says exactly that. You know the one farther along, we'll know all about it, farther along, we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother. Live in the sunshine, we'll understand it all by and by.
I think that's just based upon facts of history. As we learn more and more knowledge, I don't think that's a faith issue. I think that's actually based on fact.
All right, let's allow these
different argument. Other people can
contrast. Okay, I promise to call on Saul Martin next. Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Well, the problem I have with this structure is this. The upper right-hand corner of the table, we feel should be filled because it sort of would give us a sense of completeness. It may not, but that's only our own desire to fill it. We may not have to fill it. If we do fill it, it could be filled with a lot of things. Somebody mentioned the idea of the idea of community or something like that, and your retort to that was it's not great enough. Well, there's a couple of ideas I have about whether that is great enough or not. I think if we on Earth are the only consciousness of existence, as far as we can know at this time, that enough is wondrous. I think that's great enough that even exists, that we exist in this way. We don't need anything beyond that. but also we don't know what there is in the rest of the universe. It's very likely. Why should it only be here on Earth? It could be that there's a vast consciousness there, which I'm using that word consciousness for the category of the personal, that is great enough to fit that role without our having to use the concept of God. Okay. All right. Thank you for letting me talk.
Okay. No, thank you for that. So it's exactly the right question to ask. Have we filled in the upper right corner of the table with the right thing? Let me give you the best answer I can in a couple of parts. I think we need to be sure that we recognize that there is an upper right-hand corner of that table, that persons don't fit into the physical universe as it's described by the laws of nature. The fact that we live in flowing time, the fact that we act for reasons to try to achieve something in the future rather than being entirely determined by our past, means that there's some context, some whole that is pretty darn different from the physical universe as it's understood by physicists. Otherwise, persons don't make sense. And we all accept that there are persons. We live our lives among persons. Thank God for that. So the question is it the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that fits in that box? Or was Heschel jumping to conclusions because he knew how he wanted it to turn out? Well, that's tough. That's where one has to be thoughtful and ask the hard questions. But here's why I became convinced that that reasoning makes sense. So we know we don't fit in the physical universe. We know we need a situation that just feels different, that has flowing time, where law is not, if the world is like this now, in the future will be like that, but instead a law that talks about choice, a future determined by our choices. And a situation that is person-like, concerned with the question of how we make our choices in our shared community is actually a fine word, has enough resemblance to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that I think it makes a really good suggestion of how, instead of religion being at odds with fact-based thinking, that it's actually driven to some kind of religious thoughts somehow like this, precisely by what we know about science and what science can accomplish, all those amazing things, and what it can't. So you do raise the most subtle question. How much have we jumped the gun by filling in capital G-O-D and attaching that to a large set of ideas that we brought to the question from the past? But I'm actually convinced that Heschel was really on to something by this line of reasoning. So are there other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat right now. Is there someone being shy about typing who's raising a hand maybe? I can't believe I've convinced everyone of everything. I see a Michael Goldenberg raising your hand. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Well, Peter, what happened to all the other aspects of the Judaism? What happened to the fellow who created the world and who brings the sun across the heavens every day and cures sickness and so forth and so on? Are all those things now obsolete because of science? And what happened to the sense of wonder? I mean, as a physicist, you can look at all those equations and say, well, this explains why all this happens. even we can predict what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But what happened to the sense of wonder when you look up at the heavens and you say, who created this? As you remember from the
Yes.
Zohar.
Yes. All right. So answer the wonder aspect of your question first, and then come back to the question of the creator and source of providence. So divine providence, not providence for violence. So wonder is there in recognition that persons are special enough that they need a whole separate row of the table. So remember my claim from week 1 that, and I have very good Heschel quotes to back me up, that the ability of persons to wonder is the most wondrous thing about the universe. It's more wonderful than galaxies, more wonderful than a beautiful sunset, more wonderful than the internal structure of a living cell. It is our existence as thinking, questioning, wondering beings. So that's at least one place that wonder comes in. Now, the question, is this the whole story of God, or do we have to jettison so much of what we learn about God by reading Tanakh? It's clear, and this is the reason your question is so excellent, that what this argument of Heschel's foregrounds is God as the revealer of the task of humanity. And for us Jews in particular, God as the revealer of the commandments that we have right there in the Torah, Torah writ small and Torah writ large. That is definitely at the foreground. Now, and if you read Heschel, there's a surprising lack of concern about God's role as creator. It's not that it's not there, but it doesn't seem to feature so centrally. And the key to seeing that that's how he's thinking is that haiku of his that I quoted at the end. The world consists not of things, but of tasks. Now, of course, it consists, among other things, of things. He wouldn't bother to waste words in a haiku saying not of things if things weren't part of the story, but he's saying the higher, more wonder-evoking aspect that there are creatures wondering about our existence, wondering how to respond with appropriate gratitude for the gift of existence, and turning to our tradition for guidance in how we should respond. Revelation is primary for Heschel's thinking. And honestly, this has tremendously profound roots in Judaism. I was thinking again about the very first Rashi. If you look at what Rashi wrote about Bereshit, Parak Aleph, okay, verse Aleph, what does it say in the beginning? God created the earth, and Rashi says, no one can understand this. His exact words were, this verse says, expound me. And then he goes on to say, this can't possibly be a description of the actual account of actual material creation. It's there to evoke a sense of wonder. And it's there, he says, here's the real question. Rabbi Isaac, he quotes, says, why do we even have Bereshit at all? Why don't we jump into the middle of Exodus where we've got our first halacha and start with the list? And the answer is, according to Rashi answering Rabbi Isaac, it's so that we know why we ought to listen to God when God gives us commandments, because God made the universe. Okay? So creation plays the role in our tradition if we look at it as Jews and not as people surrounded by so many fundamentalist readers of the Bible. It plays a secondary role, a legitimating role for the story of we've got a job to do. In fact, a lot of them get to work. That's I think how Heschel would answer it. Okay, and Rabbi Zarin is reminding me that I had missed a question in the chat from before, from Renee Rulin. And let me read what she wrote, and let's see if we will still have time to discuss it. Uncertainty in subatomic physics suggest not exact solution to position and energy. Is this a pathway to faith? So quantum mechanics, is it a pathway to faith? Some people think so. Renee, are you still here, and do you want to say some more?
Yes, actually, I'm Henry. Go ahead.
Henry, go ahead. Sorry, Henry.
Yeah, it's my fault. I'm the Henry partner. Just put that in since, if you will, the material world that you describe respectfully, there seems to be a Newtonian one. And even though you allude to space-time, which already convolves gravity and time, it seems to be a different world than what I thought was the mainstream in physics. And then jumping ahead to the faith part of this business, I was taught by one of my professors in college that the matter of religion and faith in God, in fact, was not amenable to rational discussion. One either believed or not, and could be, led either way. And the last bit, which follows up on that for me, and which I hope you can enlighten me on, has always been the problem of evil in the world. And how is it that a fellow named Adolf Hitler had a mission in life? And could one not argue that the Treaty of Versailles, the failure of the Weimar Republic and the humiliation thereof made fertile ground for his forward progress through time? God help us.
God help us. So you raise a lot of really good questions, Henry. Let me respond to your original one first. There are people who think that the quantum mechanical view of the world, with all of the uncertainty and chance elements, is how freedom of will enters the world. There are some people who think that the role of observers in quantum mechanics is how to fit religion into the world. I'm not sure I agree, but I respect the people who put the idea forward, and it could be a long discussion why they're either right or I'm right to doubt it. If I can jump to your last point about what about the problem of evil, I think this relates to a little bit to Mark Goldenberg's question, but it needs a fuller answer maybe than he got from me. Heschel is the last person to say that, oh, God exists because life is perfect. And he's actually remarkably reticent on the question of evil, given that he fled the Holocaust one step ahead of Hitler and lost many family members. He doesn't tend to talk about it a lot, but enough so that you know that he's 100% aware of how much evil there is in the world. And I think he points to the part of our tradition, not that says God makes everything happen for a reason, but that God gives us tasks. And in fact, the most direct thing I ever saw Heschel say, right, that is to say, on the question of the Holocaust was, he said, the question about the Holocaust is not where was God. The question is, where was humanity? And that fits in with his idea that the world consists of tasks given to us. And it's up to us to learn what our role is and to do it with all the courage that it takes. We're going to fail, some more egregiously than others. Those of us who are trying very hard not to fail have to do our best. And so he was willing to jettison any notion that God just makes everything come out right. He knew better. So I hope that's at least a good first response to you. Now,
Thank you.
we've gone past 9 o'clock. I think I ought to let you all go with my thanks for your patience and attention through these 3 lectures. I appreciate very much these questions and would love to have opportunities to meet with you all either on a one-on-one Zoom or let God make it possible very soon for us to meet in person. So thank you again for doing me the honor of listening. Good night, everyone.
Yesher koach. Thank you so much. I hope you can see all the applause around the gallery. This has really been a fabulous 3-week journey. So thank you, Peter. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm going to stop the recording now. I'll leave the room open in case anyone has any lingering questions.
Sure, and I'll stick around.